Close your eyes for just a moment. Imagine a Mississippi morning in September of 1859. The air is thick, heavy with the smell of cotton balls and damp red earth. Somewhere in the distance, a field slave is singing low and slow, a sound that barely rises above the buzz of insects. The sun is at that particular angle, that golden, brutal afternoon angle where everything it touches turns to fire. And in that light, a little girl is walking across a yard. She can't be more than 7 years old. She's carrying a basket of folded linens that's almost too heavy for her small frame. Her headcloth has slipped, and her hair, her beautiful, soft hair, is falling around her face in waves. She doesn't know anyone is watching, but someone is. And in that single moment, the course of that little girl's entire life is changed forever. Not because she did anything wrong, not because she spoke out of turn or broke a rule or caused any trouble whatsoever, but simply because she was seen. Simply because, in that brief slice of afternoon light, she was undeniably, heartbreakingly beautiful. Her name was Seraphina Drake, and what happened to her next is one of the most disturbing, most extraordinary stories I have ever had the privilege of telling. You see, to understand Seraphina's story, you first need to understand the world she was born into. And I don't mean that in a vague historical sense. I mean you need to feel it, the specific gravity of it. The Whitmore plantation in Warren County, Mississippi, stretched across 1,800 acres of the richest cotton land in the entire delta. The main house sat on a gentle rise overlooking the fields, a 2-story Greek Revival mansion with white columns and wide verandas that seemed almost obscene in their elegance. Because everything that built those columns, everything that paid for that grandeur, was human suffering. In 1859, 147 enslaved people worked that land and produced nearly 500 bales of cotton every year, making the Whitmore family one of the wealthiest in the region. The master of the house was Colonel James Whitmore, 63 years old, 2 terms in the Mississippi state legislature, a man who considered himself a gentleman of the highest order. He owned human beings the same way he owned horses and furniture, casually, without a second thought. But here is the thing about the Whitmore household that you need to understand. The real power, the day-to-day, iron-fisted nothing, escapes my attention power, did not rest with the colonel. It rested with his wife. Helena Whitmore was 41 years old in 1859. She had once been the most admired debutante in Natchez society. And time, the way it has of doing, had not been entirely kind to her. Not in the way she needed it to be. She had given her husband 3 sons. She had maintained her household with military precision. She supervised the house servants personally, ruling them with a control so complete it bordered on obsessive. But Helena lived with a secret bitterness that had been growing in her for years. She could see it every morning in her mirror, the fine lines, the slight loosening, the slow, quiet erasure of the beauty that had once defined her. This matters, remember this, because everything that is about to happen flows directly from that wound inside Helena Whitmore. Now Seraphina, she was born in the spring of 1852, although in this story the documented year we follow begins in 1859. She came into the world in a small cabin behind the main house where her mother, a laundress named Ruth, lived and worked. Ruth spent 14 hours a day washing and pressing the fine linens of the Whitmore family, her hands permanently scarred by lye soap and scalding water. But she kept her daughter close, and on the night Seraphina was born, she looked at that tiny face and felt something she hadn't felt in 32 years of bondage. Fear, not the ordinary fear of an overseer's whip. This was something deeper. Ruth looked at her daughter at those amber eyes, already strange and luminous, and understood with the kind of bone, deep instinct that only mothers possess, that this child's beauty was going to be either her salvation or her destruction. She named her Seraphina, after the highest order of angels, the burning ones, the ones closest to God. She had heard the plantation mistress read the word aloud from a book of religious poetry years earlier. Ruth could not read or write, but she never forgot that word. She whispered it into her daughter's ear that first night, and she prayed that heaven might protect what she herself could not. For the first 7 years of Seraphina's life, Ruth tried everything she could think of to keep her daughter invisible. She dressed the girl in the plainest, most shapeless clothes she could find. She wrapped her hair tight under a rough cloth. She rubbed dirt on her face on the mornings she knew the mistress would be walking the grounds. She kept her in their cabin as much as possible. She drilled into her the rules of survival that every enslaved child had to learn before they could even understand the words. Stay quiet, stay small, never look a white person directly in the eye. Old Bessie, the kitchen slave who claimed to have the gift of sight, had warned Ruth the moment she first saw the baby. Keep that child hidden, she said. That kind of pretty brings nothing but trouble. Either the men going to want her, or the women going to hate her. Either way, it ends in blood. Ruth tried. God knows she tried, but you cannot hide the sun behind a handkerchief. And then came September of 1859. Helena Whitmore decided to conduct one of her unannounced inspections of the domestic work areas. She did this periodically, appearing without warning, looking for any excuse to remind the enslaved people of their place. On this particular afternoon, she walked past the laundry area, just as Seraphina emerged from the cabin, carrying a basket of folded linens. The girl didn't see her coming. She was focused on balancing the heavy basket, careful not to drop a single sheet. The cloth had slipped from her head. Her hair fell in soft waves around her face, and the afternoon sun, that specific, golden, unforgiving September sun, caught her at exactly the right angle. Helena Whitmore stopped walking. She stood completely still for several seconds. People who were there would later struggle to describe the expression on her face. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was something deeper, something more dangerous. It was the look of a woman who had just encountered something she could not tolerate, something she could not accept. Ruth saw the mistress and felt her blood turn to ice. She dropped everything and rushed toward her daughter. But she was too late. Helena had already seen, and what Helena saw, she could never unsee. That night, Helena lay awake in her canopied bed, while her husband snored beside her. She couldn't stop thinking about the slave girl, couldn't stop comparing. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw those amber irises. That perfect skin, that unconscious, effortless beauty that a 7-year-old child hadn't even asked for. And the rage building inside her, she would later tell herself it was about discipline, about order, about the girl's insolence, frightened even herself. By morning she had made her decision. The cellar beneath the Whitmore mansion had been built in 1841. It was a large space, nearly 40 feet long, 20 feet wide, with stone walls and a dirt floor. One section held the Colonel's collection of imported French wines. The back portion was simply unused. Dark, damp, even the house servants rarely went in there. This was where Helena decided to put the girl. She gave the orders to the overseer, a man named Thomas Crenshaw, who carried them out without question. He was paid well not to ask questions. That evening, after the Colonel retired to his study with a glass of brandy, 2 of the domestic slaves came to Ruth's cabin. They took Seraphina. Ruth screamed and begged and fought. She scratched and bit like a wild animal trying to reach her daughter. Crenshaw struck her across the face with the back of his hand and knocked her to the ground. if you say one word about this." He told her, "I will sell you to the traders, and you will never see this place again. You will never know what happened to your girl." Ruth understood. She understood completely. She understood that she was powerless, that her daughter had just been swallowed by the earth, and that there was nothing she could do about it. They carried Seraphina down the wooden cellar stairs and chained her ankle to an iron ring bolted into the stone wall. A tiny window, no bigger than a man's hand, sat near the ceiling, letting in a thin sliver of daylight for a few hours each afternoon. For the rest of the time, Seraphina existed in total blackness. She could not see her own hands in front of her face. She was 7 years old. Now, this is the part of the story that I need you to really sit with. Because what happened over the next several years, what happened to the mind of a child left alone in the dark, is almost impossible to comprehend. But it's also, in a strange and terrible way, the most extraordinary part of everything that comes next. Helena established a routine. Twice a day, a kitchen slave would bring a bowl of food to the cellar. Cold cornmeal mush in the morning, scraps from the family's dinner in the evening. The slave who brought the food was forbidden to speak to Seraphina, forbidden to bring a candle, forbidden to tell anyone what was in that cellar. Violation of these rules meant immediate sale to the slave traders. For the first few months, Seraphina screamed whenever the door opened. She begged and promised and pleaded. But the slaves who brought her food couldn't help her even if they wanted to. They were as trapped as she was, imprisoned by the same system that gave none of them any power or choices. They left the food, and Seraphina remained alone in the darkness. Time became meaningless. Without sunlight, without rhythm, without work to structure her hours, she lost track of days. Days blended into weeks, weeks dissolved into months. She slept when she was tired. She ate when food appeared. She cried until she had no tears left, and then, slowly, something inside her began to change. The human mind is a remarkable thing. Faced with conditions that should have driven her to madness, Seraphina's consciousness found ways to survive. She began creating structure out of nothingness. She counted her breaths in sets of 100. She recited every word she could remember her mother ever saying, playing the conversations over and over until they felt as real as any physical object. She traced patterns on the stone floor with her fingers, memorizing their shapes in the dark. She invented stories, entire worlds, that lived only in her imagination. But the most extraordinary adaptation she made, the one that would eventually save her and destroy the Whitmores, was learning to listen. You see, the cellar sat directly beneath the main floor of the mansion. The stone walls muffled most sounds. But the wooden floorboards above her head, they let things through. When she pressed her ear against the wall at just the right spot, she could hear voices from the rooms above. At first, they were just meaningless vibrations, but over time, as her other senses sharpened in compensation for the darkness, she began to distinguish words. Then sentences, then entire conversations. Seraphina heard everything. She heard the colonel arguing with business partners about gambling debts. She heard Helena screaming at house servants for imaginary failures. She heard the 3 Whitmore sons, William, Robert, and Thomas Jr., discussing their plans and their secrets when they thought nobody was listening. She heard visitors arrive and depart. She heard whispered confessions and shouted accusations. The house above her held no secrets she did not eventually discover, and she remembered every single one. By her 2nd year in the cellar, Seraphina had built a mental catalogue of the Whitmore family's most closely guarded information. She knew the colonel had borrowed heavily from a New Orleans bank to cover gambling debts hidden from his wife. She knew the eldest son, William, had fathered a child with a free black woman in Vicksburg, and was paying her to stay quiet. She knew the middle son, Robert, had stolen silver from the family collection to fund his drinking. She knew the youngest, Thomas Jr., was terrified of his mother and cried himself to sleep most nights. And she knew things about Helena. She knew the mistress had pushed a house slave down the stairs, causing the woman to lose her unborn child, and had convinced everyone it was an accident. She knew Helena had been skimming money from the household accounts into a private fund her husband knew nothing about. She knew Helena had once forged a letter to destroy her own sister's engagement, a secret she had never breathed to another living soul. This knowledge became Seraphina's most precious possession. In the darkness, where she had nothing else, she had power. Not the power to escape, not yet, but the power of knowing, the power of patience, the power of understanding her enemies far better than they understood themselves. Her mother Ruth managed to reach her at first. For the first 3 years of the imprisonment, Ruth bribed a kitchen slave to pass messages through the food deliveries. Simple whispered words, repeated before the slave left the cellar. * Your mama loves you. Stay strong. I'm still here. * These fragments were the only thing keeping Seraphina tethered to hope. But in the winter of 1862, the messages stopped. And eventually, Seraphina heard the truth through the floorboards. Ruth had died of pneumonia. She had worked through a fever, too afraid of punishment to rest, until her lungs filled with fluid. She was buried in the slave cemetery behind the cotton fields, in an unmarked grave. Seraphina did not cry when she learned this. She had exhausted her tears years earlier. Instead, she felt something new crystallizing inside her. Something cold and hard and patient, like a diamond forming under impossible pressure. It was a kind of hatred that did not burn hot and explode and exhaust itself. This was the kind that could wait, that could plan, that could endure anything for as long as it needed to in order to achieve its purpose. And now she knew exactly what that purpose was. The war changed everything, even in the darkness. Seraphina had been listening to the conversations about it for years. She heard the Confederate fervor, the celebrations, the absolute certainty of quick Southern victory. But she also heard the colonel's private conversations with more cautious business associates. She heard the whispered concerns about the Union naval blockade, about supplying a war of attrition, about the difficulty of fighting a more industrialized enemy. While the Whitmore family believed their own propaganda, Seraphina, locked in her cellar, knew better. By 1862, the reality of war was penetrating even the isolation of the plantation. Cotton prices collapsed. Supplies grew scarce. The overseers were drafted into the Confederate Army. The enslaved population grew restless, sensing that the world they had known was beginning to crack at the foundations. The plantation slowly fell apart around her. By the winter of 1864, most of the enslaved people had fled north toward Union lines. The fields lay fallow, cotton rotting where it stood. Helena had reduced the household to a skeleton crew and was cooking her own meals, something she had never done in her privileged life. The great white mansion, once the emblem of everything the Whitmores had built, began to show its age. Paint peeling from the columns, shutters hanging crooked, gardens swallowed by weeds, and through all of it, Seraphina remained in the cellar. The food deliveries became so sporadic, sometimes 3 or 4 days without anyone opening the door, that she survived on rainwater seeping through the tiny window and on rats she caught with her bare hands in the dark. She had become something less than human and more than human at the same time. Stripped down to pure will, pure burning purpose, on April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse. The war was over, the Confederacy was dead, and somewhere beneath the Whitmore mansion, a young woman who had been imprisoned for nearly 6 years, heard the news through the floorboards. For the first time in 6 years, she smiled. The moment of liberation came on a warm evening in late May 1865. It wasn't Union soldiers who came for her. It was old Bessie, 73 years old, too frail to have run when the others fled, one of the few who had stayed behind. But Bessie had never forgotten the girl in the cellar, and now, with the old world crumbling, she had decided it was time to act. She descended the cellar stairs carrying a candle. The light, dim as it was blinding to Seraphina's darkness, adapted eyes. She shrank against the wall, shielding her face. For a terrifying moment, she thought Helena had come to eliminate the evidence of her crime before Union authorities arrived. But the voice was Bessie's, cracking and ancient and full of emotion. Girl, the war is over. You are free. Do you understand me? You are free. Bessie had brought tools, a hammer, a chisel, stolen from the shed days earlier and hidden under her mattress. She knelt beside Seraphina and worked at the rusted iron ring for nearly an hour before it broke free from the stone wall. Seraphina stood for the first time in years. Her legs could barely hold her. She leaned against the wall, breathing hard, feeling the strange and overwhelming sensation of being upright. Bessie helped her up the stairs. She told her to run, to go to Vicksburg, where Union soldiers would help her. The only sensible thing to do was leave, now, immediately. But Seraphina did not move toward the door. She turned, and she looked back into the house, toward the rooms where the Whitmore family slept. Bessie took a step backward. No, Seraphina said. Her voice was rusty from disuse, barely above a whisper, but the word was perfectly, absolutely clear. I am not leaving, not yet. What happened over the next 2 weeks would have been remarkable in any person. In someone who had spent 6 years in a cellar, it was simply astonishing. Every night, while the Whitmores slept, Seraphina explored the house. She moved silently through hallways she had only ever known through sounds and vibrations, and she knew exactly where she was going. She knew which floorboards creaked, which doors squeaked, which rooms were occupied at which hours. She had mapped this house in her mind across thousands of nights of listening. She found Helena's private office on the 2nd floor. The lock was old. She worked it open with a hairpin she found on a dresser, using skills she had never been taught but had somehow intuited in the darkness. Inside, stacks of papers, correspondence, household ledgers, organized with Helena's characteristic precision. She found the doctored household accounts, the letters documenting the cover-up of the slave woman's death on the stairs, the correspondence with New Orleans lawyers revealing the full extent of the family's debts, far worse than even the colonel knew. And then she found something she had not expected, a letter from a doctor in Natchez, dated 1858, confirming that Helena Whitmore was barren, that she could not bear children, and that the 3 sons she had presented to the world as her own had been purchased in infancy from a slave trader who dealt in light-skinned children who could pass for white. The Whitmore sons were not Whitmores at all. They were the children of enslaved women, bought as babies and raised as white aristocrats. Helena had maintained this deception for over 30 years, terrified that the truth would destroy her marriage, her social standing, her entire constructed identity. And now this secret belonged to Seraphina. She chose her moment carefully. On a Sunday morning in mid-June, while the family was at breakfast, Seraphina walked through the door of the dining room. Helena looked up, and the sound that came from her throat was barely human, the scream of someone seeing a ghost, someone seeing the dead rise. She knocked over her chair, scrambling backward, pressing herself against the wall. her eyes stretched wide with terror. The colonel stared in confusion. He had never known about the girl in the cellar. Helena had kept that secret as carefully as all the others. To him, this was simply a strange young black woman who had entered his home. Good morning, Seraphina said. Her voice was calm, almost gentle, but there was something underneath the softness, something that made the air in the room go very still. I believe we have some matters to discuss. She told the colonel everything, precisely, without emotion, as if she were giving testimony in a court of law. She described the cellar, the chain, the years of darkness, the near starvation, the absence of human contact across 6 years of her life, beginning when she was 7 years old. She watched the colonel's face go through horror, disbelief, and then something that looked, for the first time in perhaps his entire life, like genuine shame. Helena denied everything, called Seraphina a liar, a thief, a runaway, but her denials crumbled against the obvious terror she'd shown the moment Seraphina walked in. And then Seraphina reached inside her dress and produced the documents. When Helena saw the letter from the Natchez doctor, she lunged for it. Seraphina stepped aside smoothly. She had spent 6 years learning patience. She could certainly outmaneuver a desperate woman, and Helena crashed into the dining table. Your sons, Seraphina said, addressing the colonel directly. They are not your sons. They were purchased from a slave trader in 1829, 1831, and 1834. Your wife has been lying to you for over 30 years. The colonel stared at the letter. His face had gone gray as ash. Thomas Jr. sat frozen in his chair, unable to process what he was hearing. Everything he had ever believed about himself, his name, his blood, his place in the world, was dissolving in the space of a few minutes. The destruction of the Whitmore family was swift and total after that morning. The colonel suffered a stroke within hours. He survived, but was paralyzed on his left side, unable to speak clearly, spending his remaining years in a wheelchair. Helena was arrested 2 days later. Seraphina had already sent copies of the most incriminating documents to the Union military commander in Vicksburg, along with a detailed account of her imprisonment. Helena Whitmore, a wealthy white woman who had chained a 7-year-old child in a cellar for 6 years, was tried by a military tribunal and sentenced to 15 years in prison. She died of typhoid fever in her cell less than 2 years into her sentence. The eldest son, William, could not accept the truth. 3 weeks after the revelation, he took his own life. Robert disappeared and was never heard from again. And Thomas Jr., the youngest, the one who used to cry himself to sleep, did something unexpected. He sought out Seraphina and begged her for any information she had about his real mother. She told him what little she knew, and she watched something shift in his eyes, something settle, or perhaps finally crack open. He eventually moved north to Philadelphia, where he lived the rest of his life as a black man, working as a teacher in a school for freedmen's children. The Whitmore plantation was seized by the federal government. The great white house, that obscene symbol of wealth built on human suffering, was divided into apartments for 3 black families. The cotton fields were parceled into small farms. The world the Whitmores had built was not just destroyed. It was transformed into something they would have found unimaginable. A community of free people, living on land they owned, building lives that belonged entirely to them. And Seraphina walked away. She left Warren County in the summer of 1865 with no money, no possessions, no family left alive. She walked north through Memphis, through St. Louis, through the gathering momentum of a country trying to reimagine itself. She worked as a domestic servant, a seamstress, a cook. She saved every cent, spending only what survival demanded. And she taught herself to read and write using newspapers and discarded books she found in the houses where she worked. The same mind that had kept her sane through 6 years of isolation had no difficulty at all mastering the written word. By 1870, she had saved enough to open a small boarding house in Chicago's growing black community. She ran it for 23 years, clean rooms, hot meals, dignity for black travelers who were turned away from white establishments. She never married. She never had children. When people asked about her past, she said only that she had grown up in Mississippi and left after the war. She did not speak about the cellar. She did not speak about the Whitmores. That chapter was closed, but she kept one thing from those years. In a small wooden box hidden beneath a floorboard in her bedroom, she kept the chain, the iron rusted. The links weakened by years of cellar moisture, but still recognizable for what it was. Sometimes, late at night, she would take it out and hold it in her hands, feeling its weight, remembering. She did not keep it out of sentiment. She kept it as a reminder of what human beings are capable of doing to each other, of what she had endured, of what she had survived, and of the single truth that had sustained her through every moment of those 6 impossible years in the dark. No matter how complete the darkness becomes, there is always a way back. The late Seraphina Drake died in Chicago on February 14, 1912. She was 60 years old. Her obituary in the Chicago Defender described her as a respected businesswoman and a pillar of her community. It mentioned her boarding house, her charitable work with newly arrived migrants from the South, her quiet dignity and strength. It did not mention Mississippi. It did not mention the Whitmores. It did not mention the cellar, but there were those who knew. Old Bessie, who lived until 1889, told the story to her grandchildren before she died. Formerly enslaved people who had worked the Whitmore plantation carried whispered accounts of the girl who emerged from the darkness and brought down her captors with nothing but the truth. I want you to sit with something for a moment before you go. Helena Whitmore put a 7-year-old child in a cellar because she could not bear to look at her. She thought that by hiding Seraphina away, she could pretend she didn't exist. She thought that chains and stone walls and years of total isolation would extinguish what she herself could never possess. She was wrong. The darkness did not destroy Seraphina. It forged her. It made her sharper, more patient, more formidable than any enemy could have imagined. It taught her to listen when others spoke carelessly, to remember when others forgot, to understand that the cruelty of the powerful is always built on secrets, and that secrets are the most fragile foundations of all. In the end, Helena was undone not by violence, not by force, but by the simple, unstoppable, patient power of a human being who refused across 6 years of total darkness to be erased. Some chains are made of iron, others are made of lies. Both can be broken. Both will be broken. It is only ever a matter of time. And Seraphina Drake, the girl in the cellar, the prisoner of beauty, the woman who waited in the darkness and emerged carrying the light, had all the time in the world.